Ask most people how many children an ancient woman had, and they'll picture a woman surrounded by 8 or 10 of them. Now do the arithmetic that picture requires. She has to be pregnant or nursing almost continuously from her late teens to her 40s, carrying small children through a landscape she has to walk across, in a body doing hard physical work on a diet that fluctuates with the season. The picture isn't just wrong. It describes something a foraging body could not actually do. So here is the real number, and it surprises almost everyone who hears it. For most of human history, the average woman had somewhere in the range of 4 to 6 children across her entire reproductive life. Not 15, not 10, 4 to 6. And the reason is not restraint. It isn't infertility, and it isn't dying young. Plenty of women who survived childhood lived well into their 50s and beyond. The reason is that her body was running a spacing mechanism she had no knowledge of and no control over. And that mechanism placed roughly 4 years between one birth and the next, automatically, for hundreds of thousands of years. You've almost certainly never heard of it. Neither, of course, had she. Start with how it works, because it sits at the center of the whole story. In a foraging society, a child nurses for a long time, not months, years. 3, 4, sometimes longer, and not on any schedule, but on demand, throughout the day and through the night, in short, frequent feeds, because the child is carried almost constantly, and the breast is always available. That isn't a parenting philosophy or a cultural preference. It is a straightforward necessity. There is no other food a young infant can safely eat. No milk from animals, because nothing has been domesticated yet. No soft processed grain, because there is no grain and no processing. No mashed cereal, no puree, no substitute of any kind. A young child in that world eats what its mother's body produces, and eats that alone for a long stretch, because the alternative is simply nothing at all. And intensive nursing does something to a body that nobody in that world could possibly have known about. It suppresses ovulation. The mechanism is hormonal, and this is the crucial part. It is driven by frequency rather than duration. It isn't that nursing generally makes conception less likely. It's that constant nursing, day and night, with short intervals between feeds and no long gaps, holds the body in a state where the reproductive cycle does not resume. Stretch those intervals out, introduce other food, let the child sleep through the night, and the suppression weakens quickly. Keep the pattern intensive, and it holds. Not perfectly, and not indefinitely, but reliably enough to push the next conception years into the future. Sit with what that actually means. The child at the breast is preventing the next child. The spacing is produced by the care itself, as a direct consequence of it, and nobody involved decided anything, negotiated anything, planned anything, or understood any part of the process. A woman simply did not conceive again while a small child nursed constantly, and by the time that child weaned and her cycles returned, roughly 4 years had gone by. Multiply that out across a life, and the arithmetic comes into focus. A reproductive span running from the late teens into the late 30s, with births falling roughly 4 years apart, produces somewhere in the region of 4 to 6 children. That's the entire answer, and it falls out of the biology without a single person intending it. But hormones aren't the only thing enforcing that spacing. There's a second constraint, and it's brutally physical. Picture a woman walking, and count what she is carrying. Food she gathered this morning, which may be a substantial weight, a digging stick, a container of some kind, and a child on her hip, who cannot walk far enough to keep up with a moving group, and will not be able to for another 2 years at least. Now try to add a second small child to that load, and then a third. A mobile foraging band covers real distance, regularly. Not a stroll, but kilometers over rough ground, repeatedly as a normal condition of life. And everything the group owns, plus everything that cannot walk, has to be carried by somebody who can. 1 child in arms is manageable. 2 is extremely difficult and slows the whole group. 3 is simply not a workable proposition for a woman, who also has to gather food, process it, and keep pace with people who need to be somewhere before dark. So the 4-year interval turns out not to be only hormonal. It is also almost exactly the interval at which the previous child becomes capable of walking under their own power for long enough to matter, which is precisely the moment the mother regains the physical capacity to carry a new one. Notice that biology and logistics have arrived at the same number from two completely different directions. That convergence is not a coincidence. A spacing mechanism that produced children faster than a mother could physically carry them would have been selected against a very long time ago, in a very unforgiving way. The 4 years isn't arbitrary. It's the answer to a problem that had to be solved. There's a third factor, quieter than the other two but real, and it compresses the reproductive window at both ends. Fertility in humans is sensitive to energy. Your reproductive system is, in effect, constantly asking whether conditions are good enough to support a pregnancy, reading body composition, activity level, and how reliably food is arriving. When the answer is no, fertility quietly drops. This isn't a malfunction. It's a system refusing to start something it can't finish. Now apply that to a foraging life. Lean bodies, constant physical activity, walking, carrying, digging, processing. A food supply that swings substantially with the season and occasionally fails altogether. Under those conditions, menarche tends to arrive later than in well-fed modern populations, sometimes considerably later. Periods of genuine scarcity can suppress cycling temporarily, even in an adult woman, and the reproductive years, as a result, start later, and are interrupted more often than they would be in a body with reliable surplus. None of that is dramatic taken alone. But stack it on top of 4-year birth intervals, and it trims the total further, pushing the realistic number toward the lower end of that 4 to 6 range rather than the higher one. So that's the ancestral pattern. Long nursing, wide spacing, a modest total, and as a direct consequence, a population that grew very slowly or not at all. This is worth stating clearly, because it's easy to miss how strange it is. For tens of thousands of years, human numbers stayed remarkably close to flat. Not because life was uniformly catastrophic, and not because people were dying in some constant, unrelieved disaster, but because the birth rate itself was genuinely low and sat very near the replacement level. Each generation produced roughly enough children to replace itself, and not many more, and the total number of human beings on Earth crept upward at a pace that would be invisible within any single lifetime. Every population curve you've ever seen showing the human explosion has an enormous flat stretch at the beginning. That flat stretch is this 4-year birth intervals, enforced by nursing and by the weight of a child on a woman's hip, holding a species almost perfectly steady for longer than agriculture, writing, and every civilization combined. Now here is the part that reverses the whole picture, and it's the opposite of what most people assume. Fertility went up with agriculture. Farming women had more children than foraging women, noticeably more. That sounds backwards, and it is worth pausing on. Farming is frequently described as harder, dirtier, and less healthy than foraging, and in a great many respects, that description is accurate. Early farmers were often shorter, more disease-ridden, and worse nourished than the foragers who preceded them. But agriculture changed two specific things about reproduction, and both of them pushed the birth rate upward regardless of everything else. The first is that it created food an infant can eat. Once you have grain, you can make porridge, something soft, calorie-dense, easy to swallow, and safe enough for a young child who has no teeth to speak of. And the moment an alternative food exists, nursing no longer has to carry the entire load. It can end earlier, not at 3 or 4 years, but at perhaps 2 or even less, which means the hormonal suppression lifts earlier, cycles return earlier, and the next conception arrives correspondingly sooner. A weaning food is, without anyone designing it as such, a fertility technology. The second change is that you stop walking. A settled woman does not have to carry her children across a landscape, because the landscape is no longer something anyone crosses. The entire logistical constraint, the hard physical ceiling on how many small children one adult can move, simply evaporates the moment a group stays in one place. 3 children under 5 is an impossible burden for a woman on the move. In a village, it is difficult, exhausting, and entirely survivable. Remove the carrying limit and shorten the nursing period, and birth intervals compress from roughly 4 years down to 2, or even less. Total births rise accordingly, and they rise fast. This is one of the central reasons why the human population, which had been very nearly flat for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, begins climbing after the adoption of farming and has never genuinely stopped since. Which brings us to the hardest part of the answer, and it needs to be said plainly rather than skipped. The number of children a woman gave birth to and the number she raised were not the same number. Infant and child mortality in the ancient world was high by any standard you would recognize. A substantial fraction of children, commonly estimated somewhere between a quarter and a third, did not survive their first year, and something approaching half did not reach adulthood. Those figures varied enormously by place, by period, and by circumstance. And they got worse rather than better in early farming settlements, where density and shared water spread disease with terrible efficiency. So the real picture looks like this. A forager with 5 births might raise 3 of them to adulthood. A farming woman with 8 births might also raise 3 or 4, having buried more along the way. Read that again, because it is the thing the raw fertility numbers conceal. Higher fertility did not straightforwardly produce more surviving children. Very often it produced a family of roughly the same size, arrived at through more pregnancies and more loss. That is the honest arithmetic, and it conveys something about the ancient world that statistics alone never quite manage. The sheer ordinariness of a kind of grief that has, mercifully, become rare in your world, and was simply a feature of everyone's in theirs. It also explains why the ancestral pattern makes sense as a strategy rather than a limitation. Think about what a human child actually requires. Not a few weeks of dependence like most mammals, but years of being carried, fed, watched, taught, and protected before contributing anything at all. Human children are extraordinarily expensive and helpless for an extraordinarily long time. And in that situation, a small number of intensively supported children may well outsurvive a larger number of thinly supported ones. So wide spacing was never a limitation the body imposed against a mother's interests. It was an investment strategy, fewer children, each with far more of everything a child needs. In that world, it was close to optimal, and the 4-year gap that looks like scarcity from here was actually the shape of a system working properly. So come back now to the present. However many children you have, or don't have, or intend to have, that number is a decision. It was arrived at through choice and circumstance and timing, and the options that happen to be available to you. If you wanted it to be different, you could, in most cases, do something about it. You know, roughly, when you're fertile, you can prevent a conception or pursue one. You can decide to start later, or stop, or not begin at all. The number is, to a very substantial degree, yours. Almost nothing about that was true for almost every woman who has ever lived. Her number was produced by a mechanism she could not perceive, and would not have believed, if you had somehow explained it to her. A hormonal break, operated by the nursing of the child already in her arms, set to a 4-year rhythm she never chose and could not override, matched almost exactly to the distance she could carry a child who could not yet walk. She wasn't having as many children as she possibly could. She was having the number her body and her life allowed, which turns out to be a far smaller number than we imagine, spaced much further apart than we picture, and shaped from beginning to end by forces that nobody in her world could see. And when that mechanism finally broke when grain porridge and a permanent house quietly removed both halves of it, the human population began the climb it is still on today. Nobody noticed that either. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about ancient human behavior, about what your body still remembers, and about the gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that is something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.